They denounced humanity before the galaxy. Earth answered with total war. The translator bead in my ear was still warm from calibration when the doors opened and they brought us into the chamber. I had walked into difficult rooms before. I had stood at the edge of decisions that could not be taken back, signed papers that changed the lives of people I would never meet, delivered news in the flat voice you learn, because emotion in those moments does not help anyone. But nothing in 23 years of service had prepared me for the scale of that space. The ceiling disappeared somewhere above us into a haze of atmospheric suspension fields and ambient violet light. The seating rose on all sides in wide, curved tiers, like the interior of a carved mountain, and every single seat was occupied. 312 alien delegates, representing 31 civilizations with histories longer than our written language, all of them looking down at a single raised platform in the center of the floor. That platform was where I was expected to stand. My name is Owen Calloway, Commander, United Earth Joint Fleet, and at that particular moment in history, the senior diplomatic and military representative of the entire human species before the Galactic Conclave. We had been working toward this moment for years. Every diplomatic team, every cultural exchange program, every joint scientific mission conducted in good faith across 4 decades of first contact had been building toward the day when humanity would stand before the assembled civilizations of the galaxy and be recognized as a full and equal member of the community of spacefaring peoples. We had been summoned, not invited. The distinction mattered enormously, and I was very aware of it as I walked across the chamber floor with my small team of 3 aides and took my position on the platform. The Vorath delegate opened the proceedings without any of the ceremonial courtesy I had been briefed to expect. His name was Counselor Drav, and he was tall the way a winter tree is tall, thin and pale and very precise, with 4 long fingers on each hand and eyes that were the color of deep ice, that pale gray blue that belongs to very cold water. He spoke in Vorath, and the translator bead kept pace easily, filling my ear with calm, measured words that carried all the warmth of a formal notice of termination. He began with our history, not the parts we were proud of. He had prepared carefully, and the preparation showed in the way a well-built case always shows, not through drama or rhetorical flourish, but through structure. He laid the evidence out the way a careful person arranges items on a table, one piece at a time, allowing each one to be examined before the next was placed beside it. 2 world wars within 40 years of each other, each one larger than the last. The development and battlefield use of atomic weapons. Environmental degradation across 3 centuries, documented in our own scientific literature, cataloged in our own archives, undeniable because we had been the ones recording it. Regional conflicts that had never fully ended, in some cases, even as we extended our reach into the stars. He moved through the list without raising his voice, without any gesture beyond the occasional slight turn of his head, and every item he cited was documented, and every item was true. I stood on that platform and I listened. I did not look away. I did not check my aides' faces to see how they were taking it. I listened to the accurate accounting of our worst centuries, and I held my posture steady, because there is a particular kind of respect owed to truth, even when the truth is being used against you. When the Vorath delegate finished his presentation, he moved without pause into the formal recommendation that the entire proceeding had been built to deliver. The Quarantine Directive, a permanent electromagnetic blockade of the Sol system and all established human colonial territories. No vessels permitted to enter or leave the designated boundary zone without conclave authorization, which would not be granted. No signals beyond a defined perimeter. Humanity, formally classified as a Stage 2 predator civilization under conclave taxonomy, a designation that meant too volatile, too historically violent, too embedded in patterns of self-destruction and intergroup conflict to be trusted with free movement among the stars, would be sealed within the borders of its own space, indefinitely, until such time as the conclave's review body determined that meaningful change had occurred. He finished, and the chamber was completely quiet. I did not move on the platform. Around the chamber, delegates began to consult quietly with their advisors. Small screens lit up on the tier rails. A few delegates looked in my direction with expressions I found difficult to read, something that might have been sympathy or academic curiosity, or simply the professional attentiveness of people watching a significant event unfold. The Keth delegate, a broad-shouldered figure with rust-colored skin and slow, deliberate movements that I had learned were characteristic of careful thought rather than disengagement, kept his eyes on me without expression. I had worked alongside a Keth research team in the Meridian colonies 4 years earlier at the Coral Forest Restoration Project, for months in inadequate accommodation with a coolant leak that never fully got fixed, and we had laughed about it regularly and done good work together. He did not speak. He did not nod. The vote began. The system was direct and visible. Each delegation activated a physical marker at their station, a luminous rod, gold for support of the directive, blue for opposition. I watched them rise one by one across the tiers. Gold, gold, blue, gold, blue, blue, gold. My translator bead named each civilization as they voted, but somewhere around the 9th or 10th marker, I had stopped registering the names and was simply counting. The Marine bloc was the last large group I was watching carefully. They represented 4 separate civilizations that had historically moved together on matters of collective security, and our diplomatic team had told me that the Marine position was genuinely uncertain in the days leading up to the session, that there had been real disagreement internally, that no reliable read of their direction was available. I watched their markers go up in sequence. Gold, gold, blue, gold. 3-1 in favor of the directive, and with that count the arithmetic was settled even before the remaining delegations had cast their votes. I knew it, and I did not allow any of that knowledge to reach my face, because the moment when a decision moves against you is precisely the moment when your expression matters most to every person in the room who is watching. Your expression tells them whether it is finished or whether it is not. I had decided it was not finished before the session began, and I let that decision sit behind my eyes while the rest of the votes came in. When the last marker was in place, the presiding officer, a Marine elder named Counselor Vosh, announced the result in that slow, resonant, full-body tone that the Marine used for formal declarations. 16 had voted in favor of the quarantine directive. 11 had voted against. 4 had abstained. The directive had passed. Counselor Drav Essen looked at me across the floor of the chamber with an expression that was not cruel. It was simply settled, the expression of a mathematician who had expected a particular result and received it. The rules allowed me to address the conclave before the session concluded. My aide, a careful young man named Patrick Wren, who had been with me for 3 years and who managed anxiety by holding a stylus very still in both hands, was looking at me with the expression that means he had notes prepared and was ready to hand them over the moment I gave any indication I wanted them. I did not give that indication. I walked to the address platform at the front of the raised area. I looked around at 312 delegates in complete, attentive silence. I took one breath. Earth will receive this decision through official channels, I said. There was a pause that lasted exactly long enough to be interesting. Counselor Essen leaned forward. Then you accept the terms of the quarantine directive? I looked at him steadily across the chamber. I said we will receive it, I told him. I kept my voice entirely level. I did not say we would comply. The silence that followed that sentence was a different kind of silence than the one before it. Deeper, more attentive. 312 beings, all of them very still. I held Essen's gaze for another second or two, and then I stepped back from the platform, turned, and walked toward the exit at a pace that was unhurried. My aide fell in beside me. My 2 other team members followed. The door opened as we approached and closed behind us without a sound. The corridor outside was empty and long and lit in pale, steady blue. I stood in it for a moment, and I was aware of my own heartbeat and of the particular quality of quiet that exists in spaces designed for significant things. Patrick Wren stood beside me with his stylus still in both hands and said nothing because he knew when I needed a moment. Then I opened the quantum encrypted channel to the Joint Chiefs back on Earth. The message was not long. I gave him the vote count. I gave him the terms as formally stated. I told them that the Vorith hegemony had volunteered to oversee compliance enforcement with a monitoring fleet to be positioned at the edge of our system within 90 days. I told them we had been given one standard galactic year to begin demonstrating compliance, beginning with the voluntary surrender of one colonial transport vessel as a gesture of good faith. Then I said, begin preparation protocols. All of them. There was a silence on the channel that lasted perhaps 4 seconds, which for Admiral Nina Graves was unusually long. Then she said, "Understood." That was all. I looked out through a transparent panel in the corridor wall at the exterior of the conclave ring, the enormous, ancient, slowly rotating structure that served as neutral ground for all 31 civilizations, with its docking spires and atmospheric bridges and the vast mechanical arms housing tens of thousands of beings from across the galaxy. Beyond it, the cold, unfamiliar light of stars that did not belong to any map I had grown up reading. I thought about Counselor Essen's presentation. I thought about how accurate every line of it was, and how it was also, at the same time, only half a picture. I thought about what the other half looked like. I thought about a team of 14 researchers declining an intellectual property settlement on a treatment they had worked for 11 months to develop. I thought about 4 months in a leaking tent. I thought about things that had not been on Essen's list because they did not fit the classification, and about how classifications are always a choice about what to include and what to leave out. I thought about what human beings characteristically do when someone tells them there is no way forward. Patrick Wren was still standing beside me with his stylus in both hands when I turned away from the window and said, "Let's go. We have a shuttle to catch." The year they gave us was, by every stated intention of the Galactic Conclave, supposed to be a period of measured compliance, quiet acknowledgement of the directive's authority, gradual, visible steps toward the reduction of our space-based capabilities, the orderly surrender of assets as a demonstration of good faith. Instead, it became something I can only describe as the most concentrated collective effort I have ever witnessed in my lifetime, and I was standing inside it the entire time, directing pieces of it, watching other pieces unfold that no single person was directing because they did not need to be. I landed back on Earth on a cold morning in October, 12 days after the conclave session, and the world I came home to was not the same world I had left. The announcement of the quarantine directive had gone through every public channel within hours of the vote being certified. The conclave had released their own formal statement simultaneously, addressed directly to the people of Earth and transmitted across every colonial communications network. The statement explained the terms, the reasoning, the classification, and the compliance timeline with the careful, comprehensive thoroughness of an organization that has written many such documents and knows how to ensure there is no room for misunderstanding. The immediate reaction was what you would expect, large and loud and pointed in many directions at once, as reactions to that kind of news tend to be. There was genuine anger, which was reasonable. There was fear, which was also reasonable. There were political voices already trying to frame the situation to their own advantage, which was depressingly predictable. But something began to happen in the weeks that followed that I had not modeled, and that most of the analysts I spoke with had not anticipated either. The reaction did not fragment. It did not turn inward the way anger usually does, spinning into competing narratives and factional positioning and the long, draining cycle of blame and counterblame that has historically been what crises produce when they are processed through the machinery of politics and divided public opinion. Instead, and I'm still not entirely sure how to explain this adequately, it unified. I have thought about it many times since. Part of it was the nature of the threat. External, total, aimed at every human being without distinction of nationality or language or any of the categories we usually use to separate ourselves from each other. The directive did not care about any of those distinctions. It classified us all together, and there is something about being classified together that produces, in people who believe the classification is wrong, a remarkable convergence of purpose. Part of it was the specific character of the quarantine directive itself, the way it was written. It was not just a restriction on what we could do. It was a judgment about what we were. A stage 2 predator civilization. In that particular kind of statement, not what you have done, But what you are tends to produce a specific response in people who believe the conclusion is incorrect, which is a determination to prove it wrong through action rather than argument. But I also think some of it was something quieter and harder to name. A readiness, as though the long, difficult, generational work of learning to share a single planet with each other, all the treaties and compromises and painful reckonings with our own history, have been building toward this without any of us knowing it. That we have been becoming a species, slowly and imperfectly, and sometimes with tremendous cost, and that this moment was the first time we had been shown a mirror large enough to see it. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. 47 days after the conclave vote, the Emergency Cooperation Acts were ratified unanimously by every sovereign government on Earth. Every colonial territory across our 17 established systems ratified separately and in sequence, the last one signing within 72 hours of the first. The acts created a unified war authority, a single command structure, a consolidated resource allocation system that placed every military, industrial, and scientific asset across human space under the authority of the newly formed United Earth Command. I was appointed as Field Commander of the Joint Fleet Response. Admiral Nina Graves took overall strategic command. Nina and I have worked together for 16 years, and our relationship is defined by a very efficient shorthand that comes from knowing someone well enough to skip the framing and go directly to the problem. We sat down in the Geneva bunker on the morning after the acts passed with coffee and a map of what we had and a list of what we needed, and we started talking. What followed across the next year is the section of this account that I find most difficult to describe accurately because the magnitude of it resists compression. The private shipyards, 43 of them, spread across Earth and the colonies, were nationalized within 2 weeks of the acts. No extended negotiation, no lengthy legal process. The framework for nationalization had already been drafted quietly by legal teams working in parallel with the political process, and when the acts passed, the paperwork was ready to sign. The owners were compensated fairly and quickly, which helped, and most of them would have given the facilities over without compensation, which says something about where the country's collective head was. The colonial terraforming fleet presented a different kind of problem. These were enormous vessels, heavy and durable and built for decades of sustained operation in hostile environments, but not designed for conflict. They carried equipment that was not useful for what we needed. But the hulls were exceptional, massive, reinforced, built to take sustained punishment from extreme weather systems and radiation environments and the kind of physical stress that comes from long-duration operations without maintenance access. We stripped the terraforming equipment. We reinforced what was already strong. We fitted new drive systems. We designated them as war vessels, and they looked strange, ugly in the particular way that things look when function has been prioritized absolutely over form. But they were extraordinarily difficult to damage because they had been built to survive 200-year missions through environments that made open space combat look hospitable. The full drive came out of classified storage in the 3rd month. It had been developed over a decade by a propulsion team at the Callaway Marsh Institute, which I want to note has my name on the building through no action of my own, as the naming happened while I was stationed off-world and I was not consulted. The full drive extended effective engagement range to nearly twice what any conclave fleet could sustain at operational tempo. We had classified it for diplomatic reasons. The reasoning being that demonstrating a significant military capability advantage would alarm conclave members who were already watching our development carefully, and that the diplomatic costs outweighed the strategic benefits, as long as we were operating in a context where diplomacy was the primary instrument. Diplomacy was no longer the primary instrument. We fitted the full drive to every vessel in the fleet. The engineering teams worked in 3 shifts, and the installation timeline that had originally been projected at 4 years was completed in 9 months. I have read the maintenance reports from that period. The error rate was lower than it would have been under normal conditions, which is a counterintuitive outcome that the project lead, a methodical engineer named Dan Harwick, attributed simply to the fact that every person on those teams understood exactly what they were working on and why. Colonel Petra Holt arrived at the Geneva bunker in the second month with a small bag, a large quantity of coffee, and the expression of someone who has been waiting for a specific problem to appear for most of their professional life. Petra had spent 30 years studying combined arms operations across every documented conflict in human history, and a significant portion of the documented conflicts in the histories of conclave civilizations she had been able to access through research agreements. She was small, fast-writing, and possessed of the methodical ferocity I associate with people who have spent a very long time thinking carefully about a single domain. Nina gave her the task of building a tactical doctrine that would not resemble anything the conclave militaries would recognize. Petra put together a team that included military historians, behavioral analysts, logistics specialists, information operations experts, and a linguist whose particular skill was the analysis of decision-making patterns in the formal communications of non-human organizations. What they produced, after 3 months of work that averaged 17 hours a day, was a framework that drew on 6,000 years of recorded human conflict. Every mistake, every innovation, every strategic insight that had been bought with loss and then written down so the next generation would not have to buy it again. And that was designed specifically for an adversary that had not fought a serious conflict in over 3 centuries. It was not a gentle document. It was, however, a very carefully thought out one. I want to give you a sense of what those months felt like from inside them, because the summary I have given above flattened something that was not flat at the time. It was not an orderly progression from one milestone to the next. It was loud and pressured and full of the ordinary texture of people working at the edge of what they could sustain. The engineering bays were running lights around the clock. The logistics teams were solving problems that did not have existing solutions and documenting their solutions as they went because there was no time to do it afterward. The medical staff I spoke with routinely had not slept in ways that satisfied them for weeks. But there was something in the atmosphere of those facilities, and I visited as many as I could because I believe that showing up matters and because I wanted to understand what I was asking people to do that I found genuinely difficult to name at the time and have thought about frequently since. It was not morale in the conventional sense. Morale is what you work to maintain. This was something that did not require maintenance. It was present in the rooms before you arrived and still present when you left. I think it came from the combination of 2 things that rarely exist together. A problem that was genuinely difficult and genuinely important in exactly equal measure. People tend to work at their best when both of those conditions are true at once. When something is easy, it does not draw everything out of you. When something is important, but you cannot affect it, the importance becomes a weight rather than a fuel. But when something is hard enough to require everything you have and important enough to make that expenditure feel like the right use of your life, people work in a way that is different in quality from ordinary effort. That was what I was walking through in those facilities. I saw it in a conversation with a woman named Louise Garrett, a structural engineer who had been working 16-hour shifts on a modification program for the terraforming fleet. She had designed a reinforcement approach for the hull sections that was not in any existing manual, something she had worked out from principles and tested on a scale model before applying it to the real structure. I asked her how she had known it would work. She looked at me with the expression of someone who finds the question slightly beside the point and said, "I did the math, and then I checked it 3 times, and then I checked it again, and then I was confident, and so it works." She said it without arrogance. She said it the way a person says a thing that is simply true. I thought about that conversation many times in the months that followed. The colonial populations were doing something parallel that I had less visibility into, but was getting reports on through the colonial administrative networks. Every colony across our 17 systems had its own version of what was happening on Earth. The smaller colonies did not have shipyards, but they had manufacturing capacity, and they had personnel, and they contributed both. One of the more distant colonies, a community of about 40,000 people on a planet called Haven that had been established only 8 years earlier and was still in early terraforming stages, sent a formal communication to United Earth Command in the 3rd month of the preparation period, offering the entire population's labor allocation for whatever task they could usefully contribute. The communication was signed by the colony's governing council. At the bottom, individually, were 42,000 signatures. I kept a copy of that document. I still have it. Meanwhile, something was happening outside the military preparation that I was only partially aware of at the time. Ambassador Senadrath, my diplomatic counterpart and one of the most genuinely skilled people I have ever worked alongside, was traveling. She was visiting the Keth homeworld. She was spending time in the Marine Station cluster. She was meeting, quietly and without announcement, with representatives from the 4 abstaining conclave civilizations and several of the 11 who had voted against the directive. She was not negotiating, she told me when we spoke. She was listening, and she was building a record of something, and she would tell me what it was when it was ready. I trusted her enough not to push. On the 364th day of our compliance window, a Vorith diplomatic vessel transmitted a formal request on the standard channels. The message informed us that Earth was required, as an initial gesture of compliance under the quarantine directive, to surrender 1 colonial transport vessel to conclave custody for inspection and certification of demilitarization. A date was specified. Coordinates for the handover point were included. The language was formal and precise and carried the particular quality of language written by someone who expects it to be obeyed. I drafted the response myself. I wrote it in Vorith ceremonial script. This form of written communication has a very specific cultural function in Vorith society. It is used exclusively between recognized equals and formal declarations of fundamental disagreement. Using it in any other context is considered either ignorant or deliberately insulting, and I was neither ignorant nor unintentional. I chose it because I wanted Counselor Essen to read the first word and understand immediately that we were not confused. We're not making a translation error. We're not sending a message we did not fully comprehend. We knew exactly what the language meant, and we had chosen it on purpose. The message was 4 words in translation. We offer nothing but consequence. On the 366th day, we crossed the blockade line. 614 vessels. Not all of them were warships in any conventional sense. Some were converted industrial hulls. Some were repurposed colony ships fitted with weapons systems that had never existed in any catalog. Some were things that did not have a proper designation because they had been built in a year of maximum effort by people solving specific problems without reference to existing templates. But all of them were crewed by human beings who had volunteered for this assignment, and all of them were armed, and all of them carried full drives, and all of them knew what they were crossing into and why. The Conclave's automated enforcement drones engaged us within 4 minutes of the crossing. 97 units, well-designed and fast, operating on targeting algorithms that made several assumptions about how an opponent would behave in an engagement. We did not behave that way. We lost 4 ships. For crews. People I knew by name because I had made a point during the year of preparation of learning the name of every person serving in the fleet, as many as I could manage, because names are the minimum courtesy owed to people who are taking risks at your direction. We destroyed all 97 drones in 11 minutes and 23 seconds. The Conclave sent a formal protest on encrypted channels within the hour. We received it. We logged it carefully. We did not reply, because there was nothing that words could usefully add to what had just happened. The galaxy was watching. Every member civilization had monitoring systems capable of tracking what we were doing, and we knew it, and we had decided before the crossing that we would conduct ourselves in a way we could account for at the end of this, whatever the end looked like. Not for the cameras. For the record, Patrick Wren, my aide, was on the bridge of the Steadfast beside me when the last drone went offline. He looked at the display for a moment, and then he looked at me. "We actually did it," he said. "We're just past the beginning," I told him. He nodded. He was very young for the responsibility he carried, and at that moment he looked it, but he also looked like someone who had decided something in a way that was not going to be undecided, and that was enough. I turned back to the display and started working through the next set of projections. Because the thing about the beginning of something this large is that there is always more to do than the moment lets you see, and the only way through is to keep moving. The first time Counselor Drav Essen called me personally We were 14 months into the conflict. I was in the tactical operations center of my flagship, the HFY Steadfast, eating something I could not have named if asked, going over engagement projections for the next 72 hours with my senior staff. The operations center had a particular smell by that point in the campaign. Recycled air and strong coffee and the faint metallic note that comes from electrical systems running at sustained high load. I had stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing any constant. My communications officer, Lieutenant Daniel Fitch, put the Vorith channel up on my secondary display and said, very quietly, he asked for you by name, Commander. I finished what I was eating. I put the container aside. I turned to the display. Essen looked older than I remembered from the conclave chamber. Not dramatically older. The Vorith aged slowly, and he had not been young when we first met, but there was something in the set of his posture that had changed. The crisp, settled precision was still present, still performing its function, but it was working harder now, maintaining itself against something beneath it that had not been visible in that first meeting. Commander Calloway, he said. Counselor, I said. You have not responded to our last 4 formal communications. We received them, I said. Each one was logged carefully. He looked at me with those deep ice eyes for a moment. Behind him, I could see the interior of what appeared to be a command vessel. Very clean, symmetrical, precisely organized in the way that Vorith design always is. Their ships were excellent. I had told Nina Graves that several times during the campaign, not because it was a comfortable thing to say, but because accurate assessment of an adversary is a basic professional responsibility. You are aware, Essen said, that continued resistance to the directive places your species in formal breach of conclave law. I am aware, I said, that the directive was a political outcome reached by a coalition that had settled on its conclusion before it heard the evidence, pushed through by a margin of 16 to 11 with 4 abstentions. I do not find that particularly compelling as a mandate to confine an entire species. He was quiet for a moment. Your losses have been significant, he said. The tone was not gloating. If anything, it was something closer to genuine inquiry. Yes, I said. They have. Then why continue? I had thought about this question in advance because it was the kind of question that deserves to be thought about rather than answered on instinct. I had thought about it in the quiet hours between planning sessions, in the moments before sleep when your mind runs without direction. Counselor, I said, your civilization has not fought a serious conflict in over 300 years. I say that with genuine respect. It is a remarkable achievement, and what it represents about your society is something I think about. But it also means that you have forgotten something important, which is that the willingness to absorb a loss is not the same thing as the willingness to accept defeat. We grieve our losses. We grieve them every single day. I grieve them. And then we adapt, and we continue, because we're not fighting in the belief that we can avoid cost. We are fighting because what we are fighting for is worth the cost. There was a long silence. You are a very difficult species, Essen said. We know, I told him. He closed the channel. I sat for a moment with the secondary display blank, and then I turned back to the engagement projections because the conversation was over and there was work that needed doing. What I had told Essen was true. What I had not told him was the part of the picture that was changing while we were speaking, which was the numbers. The Vorith had entered this conflict with roughly 4 times our fleet capacity. By month 8, that ratio had moved to something closer to 2.5 to 1. By the time Essen called me at month 14, we had achieved near parity in active engagement capacity, even though their total vessel count still exceeded ours, because a significant portion of their available fleet was committed to positions and supply routes they could not abandon without triggering cascading failures in their logistics system. Colonel Petra Holt had been right in her core assessment, which was that an adversary who has not fought in 3 centuries does not know what it does not know. The Vorith were genuinely skilled. Their tactical formations were elegant, mathematically sound, optimized for the kind of warfare they had trained for. The problem was that they had trained for a specific kind of warfare, declared formal, governed by protocols that both sides honored, conducted in spaces that had been designated in advance as engagement zones. They expected that an opponent would respect the 2-hour notification window before an engagement. They expected that we would maintain conventional spacing between vessels. They expected that we would engage their fleet directly rather than attacking supply routes when the fleet was what had been reinforced. We did none of those things. We attacked supply lines in the spaces between designated engagement zones. We used drone systems in configurations that no conclave military had developed countermeasures for, because those drone systems had been designed for industrial applications and their combat adaptation was not in any doctrine manual. We transmitted on frequencies and in patterns that occupied the Vorth signals analysis teams for weeks at a time, partly because some of what we transmitted was genuine encrypted intelligence, and partly because some of it was randomized noise designed specifically to occupy the analysts. We feigned retreats and converted them into encirclements. We sent single vessels in directions that appeared tactically meaningless, and 72 or 96 hours later, the purpose became clear. Every engagement produced a data set. The team Petra had built to analyze engagements and update doctrine was working continuously throughout the campaign, and our tactics changed faster than the Vorth could adapt to them, because our adaptation process was faster than theirs. Theirs required institutional approval at multiple levels. Ours required Petra, a good data set, and a working coffee machine. By month 10, 3 of the 4 civilizations that had abstained in the original vote had opened quiet communication channels to the United Earth diplomatic mission. They were not offering support. They were asking questions. The questions were pointed in a specific direction, which was, what do you want out of this? That question was Senna's to answer, and she answered it in a way that only Senna can, which is to answer the question underneath the question rather than the question itself. Not what do you want, but what are you afraid of? And then to show, very carefully, that the two things were more connected than they appeared. I want to describe what the campaign itself felt like in the months between month 10 and month 16, because I've spent too much of this account on the large movements and not enough on the particular texture of what it was to be inside the thing. We were fighting at sustained pace across multiple engagement zones simultaneously, which meant that the steadfast operations center rarely went quiet. The shifts rotated, the crew changed, but the pace did not change, and the decisions that landed on my desk did not pause for shift changes. I developed a habit during this period of taking 30 minutes in the middle of each sleep cycle to sit in the observation room at the forward end of the ship and simply look at the stars outside. It was not a dramatic habit. I did not think important thoughts during those 30 minutes, or if I did, I do not remember them now. I looked at the stars, and I let my mind do what it needed to do without direction, and then I went back to the bunk and slept the remaining portion of my allocated rest. Lieutenant Daniel Fitch, my communications officer, was one of the people I depended on most during those months, and I want to say something about him specifically because the histories of this period tend to focus on commanders and strategists and miss the people who made those commanders functional. Fitch was 26 years old when the campaign started. He had been assigned to the Steadfast 3 months before we crossed the blockade line. He had, at that point, never been in an engagement. What he had was the quality of absolute reliability. When I asked for something, it was there. When I needed information, it was accurate. When I was operating on insufficient sleep and processing too many things at once, he had the discipline to prioritize the thing I needed most and put in front of me without asking me what I needed. That quality, anticipatory and quiet and completely dependable, is worth more than most things I can put a name to, and the campaign would have been harder without it. There was a period in month 12 that I think of as the most difficult stretch of the conflict, not because our position was at its worst. By month 12, the numbers were already improving, but because the improvement was not yet visible to the people carrying the weight of it. We had lost a significant number of ships in a 3-week period when the Vorth adapted their formation tactics faster than we had anticipated, and our own adaptation was lagging. 14 vessels in 3 weeks. I attended the casualty briefings, and I read every report, and I wrote communications to every family through the coordinated system that had been set up for exactly this purpose, and I would not describe the experience of writing those communications in detail here, because it belongs to the families, not to the account. What I will say is that the response to those losses across the fleet was not what I had feared. I had feared that sustained attrition would produce a shift in the character of the engagement, a hardening into something less disciplined, driven by grief rather than judgment. What I saw instead was steadiness, not the absence of grief, which was visible and real and not suppressed, but grief alongside function, the ability to carry a loss and also carry a task, which is one of the more demanding things human beings are capable of, and which I had never seen demonstrated at this scale. I had a conversation with a crew member in the medical bay of the Steadfast in the third week of that difficult stretch. His name was Corporal Ian Doyle, and he had been pulled from the water near his disabled vessel by a recovery team and had a broken arm and a significant concussion and the particular flat expression that appears after a very close experience with a thing going very wrong. I stopped at his bay on my walk-through of the medical section. He was awake, staring at the ceiling. I asked him how he was doing. He turned his head and looked at me with those flat, exhausted eyes and said, "I keep going over it, trying to find the thing we should have done differently." And I said, he was quiet for a moment. "I think we did everything right and it still went wrong, which I'm having trouble knowing what to do with." I sat down in the chair beside his bay, which is not something I do often during walkthroughs because there are always many places to be. But I sat down. "That is the thing they do not put in the training," I told him. "The part where you do everything correctly and it still costs something. There is no satisfying answer to it. You did not do a thing wrong, and that does not bring back your ship, and those two facts have to exist in the same space." He looked at the ceiling again. "Does it get easier?" "The carrying of it gets more practiced," I said. "Whether that is the same as easier is something I have not resolved." He was quiet. Then he said, "Are we going to win?" I looked at him for a moment. At 23 years old, broken arm, concussion, staring at the ceiling of the medical bay of a ship in the middle of a war that had no guaranteed outcome. "Yes," I said, "but not because of anything that guarantees it. Because of the way people like you answer a question at a moment when answering it costs something. That is the only guarantee we have. And it is not nothing." He nodded. He looked like he was going to sleep. I stood up and continued the walk through. I thought about that conversation for a long time. Not because it was unusual. I had versions of it with many people across the campaign, but because it contained the question that sat at the center of everything, the one that Essen had essentially asked from across the conclave chamber floor. Why continue when the cost is real and the outcome is not certain? And the only honest answer I could ever find was the one I had given Ian Doyle, which is that there is no guarantee, and the people who show up anyway are the only guarantee there is. Petra Holt had a phrase she used in her tactical briefings when discussing an engagement that had gone badly. She would say, "We note this. We learn this. We proceed." It was not a way of minimizing what had happened. It was a way of identifying the sequence that loss requires, in that order, without skipping any of the 3 steps. I heard other officers using the phrase in the months that followed, and then heard it from crew members on deck, and I thought about how language moves through a community when it names something true. In month 15, we had an engagement near the Voris Secondary Supply Depot at a point designated on our charts as Relay 7 that I want to describe specifically because it illustrates something about what the campaign had become by that point. The Vorith had reinforced Relay 7 with a defensive screen of 42 vessels, significantly more than the route's standard protection. This told us that they knew we knew the depot was there, and that they had decided to make holding it a statement of intent. The standard response to a reinforced position is to engage it directly with superior force, hold the position, and move on. We did not do that. Captain Ellen Marsh, commanding a squadron of 12 converted industrial vessels that had been adapted for high-speed operations, took her group on a transit that required 2-fold drive jumps and 31 hours of travel to a position well behind the reinforced screen. She arrived at a secondary fuel transfer point that fed the depot, which was protected by 6 vessels rather than 42. She took the transfer point in under an hour without the 42-vessel screen being able to reach her in time to intervene. The depot itself became non-functional within 8 hours because without the fuel transfer point, it could not sustain its own systems. 42 ships, reinforced as a statement of intent, sat at a position that was no longer worth holding. Ellen Marsh brought her squadron back, having lost one vessel. The crew of that vessel had evacuated and were recovered. No casualties. I read her engagement report and sent back 3 words, exactly as intended. Because it was. What Petra had built and what the crew had executed was the thing we had been trying to build from the beginning. Doctrine that treated the opponent's assumptions as the actual terrain to be navigated, rather than treating the physical positions as the only thing that mattered. Ellen Marsh came to find me in the operations center of the Steadfast 2 days after the Relay 7 engagement. She was a compact, practical woman with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of operational calm that comes from a great deal of experience with things going wrong and then going right because of decisions made clearly under pressure. She did not want to talk about Relay 7 specifically. She wanted to talk about the next 3 months because she had looked at the strategic map and had a proposal for a sequence of 4 operations that, if executed in a particular order, would create a cumulative effect on the Vor supply network that no single operation could produce on its own. She walked me through it for 40 minutes on a wall display while Petra Holt sat in the corner, taking notes with the focused expression she gets when someone is showing her something she has not thought of yet. When Ellen finished, Petra put down her notes and said, "The 3rd operation depends on a full drive transit window that is available for 6 hours. If we miss it, the sequence breaks." "We will not miss it," Ellen said. "How certain?" Petra asked. Ellen looked at her. "I have 17 people who have been training on that specific transit window for 6 weeks. We will not miss it." Petra nodded and picked her notes back up. "We did not miss it." The sequence ran as designed, and its effect on the Vorth supply network in months 13 through 15 was a significant factor in the numerical convergence that was visible by the time Essen called me on the secondary display of the operations center. In month 16, the Vorth called an emergency session of the full galactic conclave. They arrived with a formally prepared proposal for collective conclave action against Earth, a coalition war backed by legal justifications drawn from the treaty structures that govern conclave military operations, with resource commitment frameworks already outlined. They presented it with the confidence of a delegation that believed it had the majority in the room. What they got instead was Senadrath. And Senna had been building something for 18 months that was about to change the entire character of what was happening. My name is Senadrath, and I want to say something plainly before I explain what happened in that chamber. I have never been comfortable with the use of force. I understand its necessity in certain situations. I am not naive about what the world contains or what it sometimes requires. I have worked alongside Owen Calloway for 11 years, and I know him well enough to know that the campaign he and Nina Graves were running was not aggression in any sense I recognize. It was refusal. The organized, persistent refusal of a species that had been told it had no legitimate place among the stars, delivered in the only language that the parties enforcing that exclusion had left available. There is a meaningful difference between those two things, and I have thought carefully about the difference across the entire course of this situation. Owen asked me to address the emergency conclave session. I said yes, and I spent 3 weeks preparing. Not preparing my remarks. I had a general sense of what I wanted to say, and overscripted speeches in high-stakes settings tend to collapse the moment the room goes in an unexpected direction. Why I spent those 3 weeks preparing was the evidence. Let me explain what I mean by that. For the 18 months preceding the emergency session, I had been traveling. I had visited the Keth homeworld twice. I had spent time in the Marine Station cluster. I had been to the Drassy Outer Territories, which require a 30-hour transit and 3 separate transit authorization documents, even for diplomatic personnel. I had met with representatives from the abstaining civilizations and several of the civilizations that had voted against the directive. I had done all of this quietly, without press releases or official announcements, because what I was doing was not negotiation. Negotiation comes later, once you know what you are negotiating with. What I was doing was research of a specific kind. I was asking a question of every species that humanity had ever worked alongside in any capacity. The question was, when we were there, were we good? I want to tell you what came back. The Keth response arrived first, which is characteristic of the Keth, who are organized in a way that makes most other civilizations look somewhat approximate by comparison. It arrived as a structured data package containing 43,612 individual documented cases, each one a separate instance of recorded human involvement in Keth scientific or ecological projects, drawn from their own internal archives, assessed by their own researchers using their own methodologies. The accompanying assessment had been written by a Keth elder named Counselor Or of Heesh, whom I had never met, and it was one of the clearest pieces of analytical writing I have read in any language. Counselor Heesh wrote that the defining characteristic of human engagement with Keth projects across the 40 years of contact was not expertise. The expertise was often significant, sometimes exceptional. But expertise is a common currency in the community of spacefaring civilizations. What was uncommon, what Heesh identified as genuinely distinctive, was presence. Human beings showed up. They showed up in the difficult places at the inconvenient times for problems that were not their problems in any legal or treaty-defined sense, and they stayed. They brought a quality of persistence that the Keth had found, initially puzzling, the behavior of beings who were solving something not because they were obligated to, but because the problem itself had a claim on them. He mentioned that coral forest restoration in the Meridian colonies, which I knew had included Owen on the original team. He mentioned a group of human oceanographers who had spent 7 years aboard a Keth research platform studying a species of deep-water organism that was in decline, working without compensation beyond their institutional salaries, living in conditions that the Keth researchers who were rotating in and out of the project found genuinely challenging. Because the organism mattered and the problem was interesting, and that combination was apparently sufficient reason. The Marine response was different in form, but equal in weight. They sent testimony, recorded, authenticated, dated individual testimony from survivors and from the children of survivors of the Cascade Plague of 2271, an epidemic that had been killing marine young at a rate that their own medical community, working at full capacity, had been unable to address in 3 years of sustained effort. The disease targeted a specific developmental window unique to marine biology, and the treatment required knowledge of marine biochemistry at a depth that was unusual for researchers outside the species. A human pharmaceutical team of 14 people, led by a woman named Dr. Claire Ashworth from the University of Edinburgh, had taken the problem on. They had worked it for 11 months. The team had access to the marine medical literature through a research agreement, and they used it thoroughly, working with marine biological advisors to bridge the areas where their own understanding was insufficient. At the end of 11 months, they had a treatment that worked. When the marine government initiated the standard intellectual property settlement, the treaty protocol that would have given the research team legal rights over the treatment, with corresponding licensing revenues, Dr. Ashworth had declined on behalf of the team. The decline was polite and brief. She had said, according to the recorded transcript of that meeting, "What would we do with a patent on a cure? Please give it to everyone who needs it." That was the point. The testimony the Marines sent me included statements from parents whose children had survived who would otherwise not have survived. I will not reproduce those statements in detail. They belong to the people who gave them, and they carry a weight that cannot be transmitted through summary. I had to stop reading several times before I finished going through the package, and I am not a person who stops easily when there is work to be done. What the Drassi sent was something I had not anticipated, and it changed the shape of what I planned to do in the chamber in ways I was still adjusting to on the morning of the session. The Drassi are not easy partners. They are private, ceremonial, formally organized around the protection of their cultural heritage in a way that most other conclave civilizations read as aloofness, though I think that reading misses the point. Their response to my question came as a set of audio recordings spanning 12 years of a series of performances that had taken place on their homeworld. The performers were human. They had gone to the Drassi homeworld as musicians, not as diplomats or researchers or cultural exchange representatives. They had heard about resonance songs, an ancient Drassi musical form with a history of several thousand years, performed for ceremonial and contemplative purposes, and nearly extinct because the last practitioners who held the full knowledge of the form were very old and had not passed it on, partly because the transmission of that knowledge takes years, and partly because the younger Drassy generation had moved in other directions. The form was dying. In a generation, it would likely have been gone. The human musicians had gone to learn it. They had gone without institutional backing, funding their own transit and accommodation, spending years on the Drassy homeworld, living with Drassy communities, working with the remaining teachers. They had not published academic papers about it. They had not treated the form as a subject of study. They had treated it as music, and they had learned it, and then they had performed it, and the Drassy had recorded those performances and held the recordings for 12 years before sending them to me in response to my question. I listened to 4 minutes and 17 seconds of one recording in my quarters the night before the conclave session. I want to be precise about something. Human beings are not biologically calibrated to receive Drassy resonance songs the way Drassy are. The frequency architecture of the form is built for Drassy sensory processing. The emotional encoding is calibrated for Drassy perception. You're not, technically, supposed to experience what a Drassy experiences when hearing this music. The humans playing in that recording were crying while they performed. You could hear it clearly. The particular quality that appears in the human voice when something larger than the performance is moving through the performer, a slight unsteadiness that skilled musicians do not lose control of but cannot entirely suppress either. They were playing another species' oldest music, and it was undoing them, and they were not stopping, and whatever they were feeling in those 4 minutes was real in the only sense that matters. I sat in my quarters for a while after I stopped the recording. Then I went back to work because there was still preparation to do, and because sitting with difficult feelings is only useful up to a point. The emergency session began at the standard opening time. The Vorath presented their collective action proposal in full, with the legal framework and the resource commitments, and it was a thorough piece of work that deserved to be taken seriously. The presiding officer opened the floor for discussion. Several delegations spoke. Then I was given the platform. I stood at the address position and looked around at those 312 delegates. The chamber was exactly as I remembered it from Owen's account of the original tribunal. The tiers, the scale, the quality of attention in the room when something significant is happening. I said, "You judge my species by its worst moments. I'm going to show you its best. Then I'm going to ask you to hold both things at the same time, because that is what honesty requires, and because anything less is not a judgment. It is a decision that was made before the evidence was examined." I presented the Keth material first. I had considered the order carefully. The Keth material was the largest in volume and the most systematically documented, and I wanted to establish early that what I was presenting was not a collection of anecdotes selected for emotional impact, but a comprehensive body of evidence that had been gathered and assessed by the civilizations themselves, using their own standards in their own archives. If the delegates understood that before I moved to the more individual, personal accounts, they would receive those accounts differently. They would not be wondering whether I had chosen examples that flattered my point. They would already know that the examples were drawn from a much larger verified pool. I read portions of Counselor Heish's assessment in the original Keth, then in translation. I described the 43,000 individual cases not by summarizing them into abstractions, but by describing specific ones. The oceanographers, in their 7 years on a research platform in difficult conditions, working on a problem that was not their problem because it was interesting and it mattered. The coral forest restoration team in their leaking accommodation, laughing about the coolant problem while doing good work. I moved to the marine testimony. I played 3 recorded statements with the permission of the families. I described the Cascade Plague, the 3 years of failed treatment, the 11 months of work by Dr. Ashworth's team, and the morning in a Marine government office when Claire Ashworth declined a settlement she had every legal right to accept, because what would she do with a patent on a cure? I named Dr. Claire Ashworth. I said the name clearly and let it be a name, not an abstraction. Then I played 4 minutes and 17 seconds of the Drassy recording. I let it play into that enormous chamber, with its 312 delegates and its carefully calibrated atmospheric systems and its long institutional history of significant decisions. I let it play, and when it ended, I let the silence after it exist for 30 full seconds before I spoke again. I named the musicians. I named them one by one, 5 human beings who had gone to a private, culturally protective civilization without institutional support and spent years learning a dying art form because it was worth preserving. When I had presented everything I had gathered across 18 months of travel and research, I stood still at the platform for a moment, and then I said what I had been working toward. You judge humanity by what we are capable of at our worst. I have spent 18 months collecting evidence of what we are at our best. We are both of those things, and we have always been both, and you do not have the right to declare that only one of them is real. The quarantine directive was not a decision about justice. It was a decision made by beings who were frightened, using the language of morality to make the fear look like wisdom. You looked at a history of violence, and you stopped there. You did not ask what had been learned from it. You did not ask what had been built from it. You did not ask what kind of people look at a record of that much self-inflicted suffering and decide, generation after generation, to spend their lives making sure it does not happen to anyone else. I paused. I'm asking you to ask those questions now. I am asking you to look at what I have shown you, and then look at what the Vorith have asked you to do, and consider whether the picture those two things make together is the picture of a species that should be permanently excluded from the community of spacefaring civilizations, or whether it is the picture of a species that is complicated and contradictory and still very much in the middle of becoming something, and that deserves the opportunity to continue that process in the company of others who might benefit from the company in return. The vote on the collective action proposal failed. 19 delegates voted against. 12 voted in favor. The proposal did not pass. I want to note something about those 12 votes because I think the honest account requires it. 12 civilizations still voted in favor of collective action against us. That was not a negligible number, and the reasons behind those votes were not all the same. Some of those civilizations were genuinely convinced, on considered grounds, that humanity represented a stability risk to the community they had built across centuries. Some of them had political relationships with the Vorith that shaped their position in ways that had nothing to do with an objective assessment of us. Some of them had simply not heard anything in the 4 hours and 20 minutes of my presentation that changed the conclusion they had arrived at before the session began. Those 12 votes are also part of the record. I present them here without argument because they represent a genuine and ongoing disagreement about what we are and what we deserve, and I believe that disagreement is going to continue for a long time after the formal resolution of this conflict, and that the best response to it is not to dismiss it, but to keep building the evidence on the other side. The Vorith delegation left the chamber immediately. 7 of their closest partner civilizations followed them out. The presiding officer formally closed the session, and the chamber began to empty with the particular kind of quiet that follows a decision that changes something. I stood at the address platform for a moment after most of the delegates had gone. The Keth delegate, Counselor Orav Hish's counterpart who had attended in person, walked past my position on the way out and stopped. He looked at me for a moment with the Keth quality of attention that is entirely still and entirely present at the same time. Then he said, in Keth, which I speak adequately, the presence of your people on our choral platform. We remember. He walked out. I stood still for a moment after that, with the chamber emptying around me, and I thought about a group of human researchers in a tent with a coolant leak, laughing about it, doing good work. And I thought about whether the Keth delegate had known when he voted that day 4 years ago that he was voting about the same people who had shared that platform with his colleagues. Whether that knowledge had been part of his calculation, or whether it had been separate from the vote, placed in a different category by the rules his civilization used to organize its decisions. I thought it did not matter which. What mattered was that he had stopped and said the thing and walked out. There was a junior aide from our diplomatic mission waiting for me near the exit with a communications tablet and the expression of someone who has been holding a message for long enough to be uncertain about the best moment to deliver it. I recognized the uncertainty and resolved it. What is it? I said. Commander Calloway is asking for a status update, he said. I took the tablet, and compose a reply. I summarized the session outcome. The vote result, the Vorith walkout. I added one line at the end that was not a summary. I wrote, "The argument worked. Finish it." I handed the tablet back and went to find a communications terminal to make the call in full. I found a communications terminal and opened a channel to Owen. He needed to know that the political situation had changed, that the Vorith were isolated now, that they were continuing the conflict without coalition support for the first time since it had begun. He listened to my summary without interrupting, which is what Owen does when something is more important than his response to it. When I finished, he said, "Thank you, Senna." "Get it done," I said, "and come home." He closed the channel. I was not in the chamber when the final terms were agreed. I was on the bridge of the Steadfast, in high orbit above a solar system I had spent the better part of 2 years working toward entering and had no wish to destroy, and the war ended in the form of a channel connection and a conversation that lasted several hours and was, in many ways, the most difficult thing I did across the entire course of this situation. But before that conversation, there was a night. Nina Graves came to my quarters 3 days before I opened the channel to the Vorith High Council. She came without ceremony, which is her consistent approach to every situation, and she put a data tablet on the table between us and sat down. "The targeting analysis is complete," she said. I looked at the tablet. I did not pick it up. "I know what it says," I told her. "Then you know that from our current position, with full fleet commitment, we can achieve a decisive outcome. Their home system defenses are at 31% of pre-war capacity. Their remaining fleet is split across 3 positions and cannot be consolidated quickly. The math is not complicated." "No," I said, "it is not." We sat in silence for a moment. 16 years of working together means that there are things you do not need to say aloud because the silence carries them. "You are not going to use it," Nina said. It was not a question. "No." She nodded. She was quiet for a little while. "The Joint Chiefs will want a justification." "The justification," I said, "is that we went to war to prove that the quarantine directive was wrong, that we are not simply what our worst moments say we are. If we end this by becoming the thing they accused us of being, if we prove the directive right in the act of defeating the people who passed it, then we have not won anything worth winning. We have just demonstrated that they had a point." Nina looked at me for a long time with the expression she has when she is deciding whether to argue. "This means harder terms," she said finally. "They will negotiate more firmly if they know we stop short." "I know. It means longer deployment. More time before people get home." "I know that too. The families of people we have lost, they're going to ask why we stop." I thought about that for a moment. I thought about it carefully because it deserved to be thought about carefully and not dismissed with a convenient answer. "I'm going to tell them," I said, "that the people we have lost died so that we could prove something. And that proving it by doing the thing we were accused of being capable of would undo exactly what those people gave their lives to establish. That the choice to stop short is not weakness. It is the point. It is the entire argument. And I think most of them will understand that, because most of them know the kind of people their people were." Nina picked up the tablet. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she set it down, stood up, and said, "I will prepare the fleet for holding formation." "Thank you, Nina." She left. I spent the rest of that night on the observation deck of the Steadfast, which is a long, narrow room at the forward end of the ship with transparent sections that give a view of the space ahead. The stars did not do anything interesting. They were just stars, cold and far away and entirely indifferent to what was happening in their neighborhood. I find the indifference of stars clarifying rather than depressing. It reminds me that the meaning of what we do is something we bring to the situation, not something the universe supplies. I thought about the people we had lost, not in the aggregate, not as a number in a casualty report, but individually, by name, the way I had trained myself to think about them, so that the weight would stay real and not become abstract. A number is easy to carry. Names are not. Names have weight that is proportional to the person they belong to, and carrying them requires something, and I believe that requiring something is right. I thought about Captain Ellen Marsh and her 12 ships and Relay 7, and about the fact that Ellen Marsh was alive, and her crew was alive, and the thing they had done was done correctly and efficiently and well. I thought about Lieutenant Daniel Fitch handing me exactly what I needed before I had finished the sentence asking for it. I thought about Louise Garrett's certainty about her hull design. I did the math, I checked it again, it works. I thought about 42,000 signatures at the bottom of a document from a colony of people who had been building their new home for 8 years, and it stopped to say, "Use us." I thought about the Drassy cruiser sitting in formation 3 weeks before the end, not firing anything, simply being there because someone had decided that being there was the correct response to what was happening and had acted on it. No announcement, no communication beyond those 3 words. We are here. That decision, made by some unknown person on a Drassy council somewhere, in a meeting I would never know the details of, for reasons they would never explain to me. That decision was what I was thinking about when the calculation about the targeting analysis was resolved in my mind. Not as a rule, not as an abstract principle about what civilized behavior requires. As a simple observation about what kind of thing calls to what kind of response. The Drassy had been here, not because we had forced them here, not because a treaty required it, not because it was in their strategic interest in any narrow sense. Because we had been the kind of people who send musicians to learn dead music and researchers to sit in tents for years, and that kind of people generates a different kind of response than the alternative. If we used the targeting analysis in the way the targeting analysis permitted, we would no longer be the kind of people. We would be a different kind, and the Drassy would know it, and the Keth would know it, and every civilization watching what happened here would know it, and the record that Senna had spent 18 months building, the careful, documented, specific record of what humanity actually is when it is at its best, will be contradicted by what we did in this moment. And no record survives being contradicted by the action of the people it describes. I was not going to let that happen. I called Senna at some point in the early hours, the time when the isolation of a decision becomes most acute. She was awake. She listened to me explain where I was and what I had decided, and when I had finished, she said, "Owen, you knew what you were going to do before you called me." "I did," I said. "Then stop sitting in the dark, overthinking it, and go do it." I laughed. Genuinely. It felt strange, and it felt right. "Good night, Senna." "Good morning," she said. "It is almost morning." She was right. The channel to the Vorith High Council took 12 minutes to establish through proper diplomatic protocols, which I spent reviewing my notes and reminding myself that patience in the opening phase of a difficult conversation is not a concession. When the connection was live, I had all 7 members of the High Council on my display. Full council formation, the arrangement they use for treaty discussions. They had been expecting something different from this call. That was visible in the set of their posture. I read them the terms. Reparations structured over 100 years, with independent conclave oversight of the payment schedule, to be distributed to every species whose interests have been damaged by the expansion of the conflict. Permanent reduction of the Vorith outer military fleet to 20% of its pre-war capacity, verified by inspectors from 3 civilizations mutually agreed upon by both parties. A formal public retraction of the quarantine directive, co-signed by every conclave member civilization that had voted in favor of it, to be entered into the permanent conclave record in a form that could not be amended or removed. And the final clause, permanent human membership in the Galactic Conclave, not as observers with limited speaking rights, not as provisional members subject to review, full members with equal standing in all proceedings and equal weight in all votes. The High Council was silent for a long time after I finished. High Counselor Feroz Dane, the senior member of the council, looked at me across the channel with those pale, ice-colored eyes that every Vorith carries and said, "You are asking us to admit into the conclave the species that has just defeated us." "I am asking you," I said, "to admit into the conclave the species that defeated you and then chose not to use that defeat in the most destructive way available. I am asking you to admit the species that sends researchers to live in difficult conditions for years because a problem is interesting and it matters to someone who cannot solve it alone. The species that declines patents on cures. The species that learns the oldest music of a private civilization because it is worth keeping alive." I leaned forward slightly. "I'm not asking you to admit us because we won. I am asking you to admit us because of the choice we're making right now, with the fleet in position and the targeting analysis complete. That choice is the argument for our membership. You can accept it or reject it, but I think you already know what it means. The negotiation lasted 11 days. There were significant points of disagreement, some of them requiring patience of a kind I had to work consciously to maintain. The reparation schedule was contested for 3 days. The fleet reduction percentage was argued over carefully on both sides. The language of the directive retraction was revised 14 times before both parties accepted the wording. Patrick Wren was with me through all 11 days of the negotiation, as he had been through everything. On the 9th day, when the language of the retraction was stalled on a particular clause that the Vorth legal team wanted softened and I was not willing to soften, we broke for a scheduled rest period and Patrick brought me something to eat without being asked and sat down across from me and said nothing, which was exactly right. We sat in silence for about 10 minutes. Then I picked up the draft document and found the solution to the clause problem, which turned out to be a matter of reordering 2 sentences rather than changing any of the words. Sometimes what a problem needs is 10 minutes of silence and someone who knows to provide it. But the terms held. Every major point held. The quarantine directive was formally retracted on the 22nd month, 7th day, and approximately 14 hours after our fleet had crossed the blockade line. The retraction document carried the signatures of all 16 civilizations that had voted for it, obtained through the Conclave Secretariat in the days following the failed collective action vote. Some of those signatures had been given quickly. Some had required conversations that Senna described to me afterward as productive but not comfortable. All of them were there. I announced the end to the fleet on ship-wide communications. I had thought about what to say. I had drafted several versions and thrown them all away because the moment already carried more weight than any words I could put on top of it. And the right thing to do with a moment like that is to keep your own contribution small. What I said was, all hands. The war is over. Get some sleep. We have a lot of work to do. The fleet that I looked out at from the bridge of the Steadfast in the minutes after that announcement was a different thing than the fleet that had crossed the blockade line 22 months earlier. We had our own ships. Yes, the converted terraformers and the industrial hulls and the fast-built purpose-designed vessels that Petra Holt's team had developed doctrine for. But alongside them were 2 Keth frigates that had arrived in month 18 without announcement or request, just appeared in formation at a tactical junction point and taken up position with us. There was a marine medical transport that had been operating in support of our crews since month 16. And there was a Drassy ceremonial cruiser, old, slow, running on systems that predated most of our space program, lit with formal ceremonial lights that had been designed for a completely different kind of occasion, that had appeared 3 weeks before the end of the conflict. The Drassy cruiser had sent a single transmission when it arrived. It said, "We are here." It had not fired a weapon. It had simply been there alongside us because someone had looked at the situation and decided that being there was the right thing to do. I have the recording of the original conclave session. The one where Counselor Essen stood at the address position and laid out our history with careful, accurate, damning thoroughness. I have watched it many times in the years since the war ended, usually alone, usually late, in the particular quiet that I have come to associate with the kind of thinking that benefits from not being interrupted. Patrick Wren asked me once why I kept watching it. He has stayed with me through everything that followed. Patrick, and has become someone I rely on in ways that were not part of his original job description. He asked the question without agenda, with the simple curiosity of someone who genuinely wanted to understand. I told him that I watch it to stay honest, because the danger of winning, if you're the kind of person I'm trying to be, is that the winning makes it tempting to revise the history that preceded it, to go back and smooth the sharp edges off the things Essen said, to frame them as the distortions of a biased presenter rather than the accurate observations of someone who looked at real evidence and drew a reasonable conclusion. The conclusion was wrong, but the evidence was real, and I am not willing to forget that, because forgetting it would mean forgetting the reason we had to fight in the first place, and the reason we fought the way we chose to fight rather than the way the targeting analysis would have permitted. The thing I notice now, every time I watch it, is what is not in that chamber during that session. There are no Keth frigates at the entrance. There is no marine medical ship in range. There is no ancient Drassy ceremonial vessel keeping position in the dark beyond the docking arms. Those things came later. They came because of choices, specific choices, made by specific people with specific names, that Counselor Essen had not accounted for when he built his case. He had looked at the history and concluded what we were. He had built a complete, accurate, well-sourced argument from the evidence available to him, and the argument was right about what it addressed and silent about what it did not. He did not ask what Claire Ashworth would say to his settlement offer. He did not ask how 7 years on a research platform comes to feel like the right use of a life. He did not ask what it sounds like when a human musician is undone by music they were never biologically supposed to be able to feel. I keep the recording because I think it is important not to be comfortable about the things that were true in it. Every item on Essen's list was accurate. Every failure he cited was real. I did not want to forget that, and I did not want the people who work with me to forget it either. A species that cannot look honestly at what it has done is a species that will keep doing it. But a species that can look honestly at what it has done and grieve it without drowning in it, and learn from it without being defined by it, and still get up in the morning and send people across the galaxy to sit in leaking tents for strangers, to refuse patents on cures, to learn someone else's oldest music until the beauty of it breaks through whatever barriers biology has placed in the way. That species is making an argument with its choices. The argument is not finished. It does not have a final sentence. Every choice adds to it or takes something from it. And the choice is being made right now, today, by people I have not yet met in places I have not yet seen, are part of it just as much as the things I have described here. We did not come this far by stopping. I do not intend to stop. Neither, I think, do we.